talked with a guy named Frank Carroll, Franklin Otis Carroll. And Frank and I have been kind of at each other's throats on the social media for 4 years. Pretty low-key throat throttling, but I mean, we've definitely kind of gone back and forth, arguing about fire policy and putting every fire out and letting fires burn, and we've never really had a good conversation. We've just kind of like responded to each other's proclamations on Facebook, and it wouldn't say it's been a very productive relationship. Anyway, Frank, he reached out to me a couple weeks ago. He's like, I think you think maybe that I'm a crazy. So he said something that caught my eye, and he said, "Yeah, I want to come on the lookout and talk to you." So yesterday we talked for an hour and a half, and I wish we would have talked like 4 years ago, because it would have saved a lot of just kind of wasted ink on Facebook. Because we have a lot in common in what we think. And so oftentimes, we agree on 90% of way things should go. And then we argue about, these things, and we kind of let things build up and be uncivil. So had a great time talking to Frank. Frank, turns out, has had a really interesting career, starting in fire and then as a lawyer. And so he's got a unique perspective on the Forest Service, on planning, on the place for planning. He's one of those people that feels like he wasted 30 years of his career writing plans that didn't work out, or that never really helped the forest be healthier. Anyway, Frank and I still probably disagree on lots of stuff, but I think it's worth watching. The more time we can spend talking to people in person, going out in the woods, hopefully, and the less time we can spend on Facebook, the better. Frank Carroll, welcome to the Lookout. Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing and why you wanted to come talk with me.
Well, I had a long career in the Forest Service and several years in private industry, and then in 2011, I retired at the end of 2011, and I didn't know what I was going to be doing, in retirement exactly, but I started getting phone calls. And people wanted assistance. I had a long career in fire, wildfire policy planning, land management planning, RPA, the roadless rule, all that stuff. But I also had a passionate interest and career in wildfire. Started on wilderness fire crews and then moved into operations and served on Type 1 teams for 11 years, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I was asked to do was help people with questions that had to do with wildfire policy and the application of policy. And so that in the last decade or so, as you pointed out fairly often, the fire world and fire policy has changed dramatically. And it really began in 2009 with the Chevron Deference Memo that Chief Tom Tidwell signed, which essentially authorized the Forest Service to do whatever it thought expedient and proper if there was no law or regulation that opposed it. So in other words, the policy was pretty simple. It was, if the law doesn't say you can't, you can. And that was the effect of the Chevron Deference, not only on the Forest Service, but on all the agencies. They essentially could write their own policies absent laws and regulations. And many agencies did that for various reasons. It originally had to do with oil spills on the beaches and so on. And there was no real science about how to handle those things. So the court in 1984, the court established what was called the Chevron Deference, um, which meant that in the absence of science and in the absence of laws and regulations and so on, the agencies could figure out what they thought was the best solution, and the courts would defer to them. And so the Forest Service was late coming to that show, but they came. And in 2009, when the chief signed the Chevron Deference Memo, um, the Forest Service really got into high gear with applied wildfire, with managed wildfire. And so, as with any new policy and kind of new ground and so on, the agencies kind of started out slow with what I call applied wildfire, managed fire, and so on. But by 2018, on the Pole Creek fire and others, Chetco Bar and so on, they had really kicked out the stops and were using wildfire as the principal management tool, the principal active management tool, because between the environmental lawsuits shutting them down and all kinds of other complications that the Forest Service faced that you've discussed over the years. The last tool that they had that they could do anything they wanted to with that was not litigable. No, you can't sue the Forest Service fighting fire in an emergency. Wasn't subject to NEPA, had waivers for threatened and endangered species and all that sort of thing. So in a way, this is facetious, but it's kind of true. They could kill all the spotted owls they wanted to as long as they were fighting fire. They had a waiver for that. And so as the agency learned, began to learn the power of wildfire use coupled with 100 years of fire suppression and all the other factors and climate and so on, all the factors that have gone into large fire sizes, um, they really started to hit their stride when drones entered the scene. And suddenly the agency was able to use wildfire for just about any purpose. In fact, they changed the whole nomenclature in the agency from watersheds to firesheds, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have these massive fires, the North Complex in August and Dixie, which you're very familiar with, and then Telegraph and the bushfire in Arizona and the Black Fire in 2022 and in New Mexico, just as a few examples. And uh, and so there was this rush in the agency, and I completely understand it. Absent the ability to do their sort of typical management up through say 1995, when the Office of General Counsel stopped defending the Forest Service in court and went to a settlement structure. The last great tool that they had was fire, and they've been using it extensively. And so this year, though, there's a new chief and a new bunch of people in charge, and they're determined to go back to forest management policies that have an outcome that results in living sustainable forests. And so you had expressed, I was listening to your interview, I think it was Patty Grantham from the Klamath, and you had asked her if she had any idea of why the agency seemed to be so much more aggressive in initial attack and so on now. And the answer is the new chief and sort of the new direction from this current administration is aggressive initial attack in fire season, and uh, and then much more aggressive active management strategies like logging and thinning and so on. And there's all kinds of issues with all of those things, but I kind of wanted to talk to you about the evolution of wildfire policy and why today everybody's kind of pulling out the stops and sending sticks of smoke jumpers in the country that was too steep, too rough last year is looking a little less steep and a little less rough this year. And so that's kind of what's happening on a policy level. So there's a lot of complexity to all that, but that's kind of the gist of it.
All right. So, and you said that 2009 was kind of a turning point in the agency. They signed the memo then in 2009 as a turning point towards using more fire. So in my career, I remember like pre kind of 2010 that we had fire use teams, and that all the in my experience, like all that stuff has gone away in the last 15 years. You know, like we don't have type 2 dedicated fire use teams anymore. We're not talking about any of this stuff. So what's the disconnect there? Like you're saying that we've had more hands off using fire for management as a tool since 2009. But in my experience, like that's about the time that the fire use teams actually went away.
Well, we don't need the fire use teams anymore. If you suddenly have think about it, you have an open checkbook, you're using P codes to do everything associated with it. You can order any resources you want to. You can manage the fire in any way that you choose. One of my favorite lines is that this fire is being managed as full suppression. That used to mean you go put the damn fire out. Now it means literally anything they want it to mean.
Right. I agree with that. Like they're stuck with this one word to try to fit all of their action into under that one word.
Yeah. And so the thing that really kicked it up a notch was the advent of the drones, fire drones, and you and I both have seen the impacts of that kind of a policy. When you put a tool in somebody's hand, if it's a hammer, everything looks like a nail to the person with the hammer. And so as fire became the ascendant uh, tool that the Forest Service has for managing public lands, why would you need wildfire use teams? You've got fire teams with everything that they command on the ground. And if you believe that restoring fire, here's another line, restoring fire to fire depleted ecosystems. If you believe that that's the way forward for forest management, and all of us believe that that's true to some point, to some extent, but if that's the wide open sort of, I'll call it the religious or the theological basis for your actions and activities, then you're going to apply fire all over the place. So why would you need wildfire use teams?
Well, I don't know. I think because you want the best people out there to do it. I would think. You know, the fire use teams had a lot of talent for managing backcountry fires.
Yes, they did. And, there are famous people like Jim Sullivan, who you may be aware of, who was one of the most successful National Park Service uh, prescribed fire and fire use operators in the history of the agency. In fact, he and I both started out in the early 70s, 70 to 72, in that period when the Yellowstone let burn policy, we called it prescribed natural fire policy, was coming online and had already moved to Saguaro National Park now, but Monument then. And, we had really simple prescriptions like after in Arizona, it was after July 15th, after an inch of rain, and after the monsoons had established. And at that point, we allowed lightning strikes to burn and we monitored them and sort of loose herded them away from infrastructure and so on. And that worked brilliantly well, I thought. And so you're right, we do need those wildfire use teams, and we need people that have extensive experience, and let's just call it applied wildfire experience. They have prescribed fire experience, they have fire ecology backgrounds, they have extensive fire suppression backgrounds, they're proven leaders and have good head on their shoulders. We need those people now more than ever. And but with the advent of this sort of new industrial wildfire world, the room for those folks has kind of gone away. And one of the problems of course, with prescribed fire, as all of us know very well, is all of the restrictions and bureaucracy and all of the things that stand in the way of reasonable prescribed fire make it so frustrating for agencies to use fire that they sort of naturally have evolved to wildfire use. Now, of course, Interior has not bought into that, that concept the same way that the Forest Service has, and neither have most of the states and so on, with some exceptions. California's got a pretty strong program, and that's all positive. But but as the policy evolved from 2009 for the Forest Service, that became the driver for everything that happened thereafter. And and so we're in this place where people were given a giant hammer and they used it like a giant hammer. I refer to your Dixie firing operations paper all the time and the videos that you produced and so on. And for very good reasons in many cases. But they used it and then they overused it. Famously in 2022 on the Black Fire on the Gila National Forest. It was burning in the Gila wilderness. It was a 5,000 acre fire, a typical elliptical wind-driven blowtorch little fire that ran across a bunch of pinyon and juniper woodland. And suddenly I have a number of slides on this and so on because I tracked it in wildfire mappers and so on as it was happening. Suddenly it had 3 or 4 different heads on it, and it was moving really strongly south into the southwest wind. And suddenly there was fire everywhere in the Aldo Leopold wilderness and in the main Gila. And it wasn't spot fires, it was drone fires. And I have some illustrations about this that it was quite brilliant, really. I mean, the people that were implementing the strategy, by the way, the strategy was to burn the entire Aldo Leopold. That's what the IC had and the ranger there had decided to do because in their view, the Aldo Leopold hadn't had fire for a long time and this was a great opportunity. And so they bent all the resources of a giant, uh, consecutive Type 1 teams to light up the entire Aldo Leopold. And, I don't think their intention was to burn it to the ground, but they had no controls. There were no indirect lines established. Fire lines that they used or anchor points that they used for the firing operations were air tankers. And so in essence, they burned, um, I'll be conservative. They lit 250,000 acres of the interior Gila wilderness and much of the Aldo Leopold until the rain finally shut them down using drones. And that was a kind of an extreme example from 2022 of the I don't know how to put it exactly, but the maximum farthest extent that you could go with a prescribed wildfire might be another way to put it. They had a prescription. Let's burn the entire Aldo Leopold. It looks like conditions might be favorable to that. Okay. And then their implementation was, let's go light it. And they did. But, that's the kind of thing that we're no longer talking about natural fire effects. Now we're talking about aggressive burning with all the attendant impacts of that. And I mean, the Gila National Forest just released what's called a RAP. I think it's a resource recovery, a recovery plan for the Gila and the Aldo Leopold. And there's extensive work that has to be done. There were terrible, just massive high severity fire across some of the oldest contiguous stands of ponderosa pines still intact in the Southwest and so on. And so those policies have angered people and frightened people and had huge impacts on small communities and on rural people. And there's been a giant backlash to that. And the Forest Service and Park Service both have doggedly refused to acknowledge their part in this. We've asked them to keep records, IMTs, to keep records of the miles of fire line that they're constructing, indirect fire line or other indirect anchors and so on, and the acres, an estimate of the acres they're lighting on fire on purpose, and they won't do it. And they hide behind this shield, this ridiculous shield of full suppression. This is a full suppression fire. And in fact, that's what they were doing in the Gila as they were lighting the Black Fire. But to the credit of the Gila Forest and the Coconino National Forest and some others, um, year before last they abandoned that line and they started just saying what they're doing.
Right.
And the Coconino's really done a great job. I mean, they're actually designing these big prescribed burn projects, but they don't burn them in prescription going through burn plans and so on. They wait till they get a lightning strike and then they herd them around like the Wildfire and so on until they've burned the project area. And they're actually having a lot of success with that. But the talent, skill, topographical features of the Coconino being pretty flat and so on the Mogollon Rim lend themselves to this. And so that's, and so there's this I kind of think of it like Game of Thrones. The dragon got loose, and the dragon's been burning down the city, and now people want to rein the dragon in. And I'm afraid that one of the outcomes of that is going to be that good uses of fire and positive opportunities and so on will be lost in the charge to try to swing the pendulum back.
Yeah.
Pendulums never stay on one side or the other. They never come to the middle. In other words, they always swing one way or another. And right now, the wildfire policy pendulum is into the 10 a.m. policy.
Right. Yeah, and I think we lose the site specificity of all of this. Like in this need to like be able to articulate something that works for the entire country. So we'll have an escape burn in New Mexico, and they're like, we're going to shut down all burning in Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, like everywhere, because we got to figure out what happened here in New Mexico. And then you and I start arguing on Facebook with Royal Burnett about these big picture ideas without any site specificity. So it's like one thing for me to say like, hey, I think we should let this fire in the Dixie Fire burn because it's surrounded by XYZ features, fuels, everything else. And then someone else is like, oh, you can't do that. It's like, didn't work out so well in New Mexico. It's like, well, yeah, it didn't because it's completely different environment that has different fire history, different terrain, different weather. And so how do we get to a place where we can talk about this stuff in a much more kind of, well, how do we develop policy that can work one
So,
way on the east side and one way on the west side? And, how do you nail down that specificity?
do you remember the Quincy Library Group?
Yeah, I did a talk on that a couple nights ago as part of that.
I heard what you said about that. I just thought I'd reference it there. And do you remember the beginnings of, yeah, I don't know how old you are, you're probably 25 or so, but in the in the back in the old days in 1980, we started doing what was called rational planning. We were using rational planning models and we're having these wide conversations and we told everybody, hey, here's 190 million acres of national forest system land. Let's have a nationwide conversation very specific to your area about what we should be doing together on these lands. And that's one reason there's so much opposition right now to the roadless rule, because in 1999, 1998, 99, the Clinton administration forced the roadless rule down everybody's throats as a way to, and I don't want to be too, oh yeah, I do, as a way to lock up potential wilderness ground without having to go through the Wilderness Act. And so that angered people because from 1980 to 1999, we'd spent 20 years talking to people about rational planning and where should we do this and that, and the Quincy Library Group, and people coming together and making hard trade-offs with each other and so on. All that went away after the roadless rule, and no one has had any conversation of any kind on a national basis about the wildfire crisis. There's been no attempt by any agency or really any groups to sit down with each other and say, hey, now we've got, 10 years of data about what's happening to our forests with these applied wildfires, with managed wildfire and so on. Let's put on the brakes. Let's sit down together locally and let's figure out together, how did this work over here on the Klamath? How did it work on the Rogue River and the Coconino and the Gila and the Santa Fe? If it's working really well, how do we keep that up in this local area, not applied to the entire country, but to a given place? And so what I advocate for is let's do what we did with the Resource Planning Act, the RPA, and let's do what we did when we started with forest planning, but let's do it in a more reasonable fashion because now we have 50 years of experience about what not to do. And let's open the conversation. Is managed wildfire a good idea? And if it is, under what conditions? Nobody's talking about managed fire in terms of the campfire or the car fire, in terms of what I think of as wildfire bomb cyclones. They take off and they go, and there's nothing in the world that can stop anything that's happening there except get people out of the way, like the campfire and a number of others that you
Right.
know
Well, and I
of.
think that's one of the problems. One of the things that I chafe at with this kind of return to the 10 a.m. policy is that there's this kind of assumption that that is possible, and and then it puts this, and so then every time fire gets away from the Forest Service, you got assholes on Facebook saying, "Oh, if they would have been more aggressive on the initial attack, they would have kept the fire out of Dinky Creek." And it's like, well, Dinky Creek's got 400 tons per acre of fuels because it hasn't had a fire in 100 years, because of beetle kill, because of lack of management, because of a lack of fire management, all these things. And so, but all the same people default to, oh, the Forest Service, if they would let Cal Fire come in here with their super scoopers and their Type 1 helicopters, we wouldn't have this going on. And it ends up leaving out of the conversation that, like, hey, there were 100 starts in Fresno and Kings County, and we couldn't get to them all, and we never will be able to, you know? So I feel like that 10 a.m. policy's got to be grounded in a reality that, hey, some places the fuels are so bad that it ain't going to work out on, and it ain't going to work out on the worst day, right?
It's always been that way. I mean, in 1992 on the Boise National Forest, we had 137 starts in one night. And that was the first time in my experience and the first time in the history of that area that we had two consecutive days where 50,000 acres burned. Air attack, trying to call in, doing rough calculations in the smoke, flying 300 miles an hour at 10,000 feet, was trying to estimate what the burned acreage was each day. And they were afraid to call it in because 50,000 acres was stupid, you
Right.
know? And so that's always going to be true. It's true today. I don't know if you've read Katie Yakis's new book out called Dancing with Fire. It
No.
is. She was a hotshot for 5 years and on heliTAC and engines and so on. And she's written. She was on Prineville and she was there in '94 and in the Dude Fire blow up. She was one of the last people not to die on the Dude Fire. And she brilliantly talks about these things, describing just from a very personal point of view what she was doing and how they were doing it. They were splitting up their hotshot crews into squads, and those squads were running out and hitting little lightning fires and putting them out. And you know what? As good as they were, and as hard as they worked, and as many blisters as they had, and everything else, sometimes you can't catch them. And so, what the chief is arguing for now, and the chief is not, he was not born and raised in the Forest Service like I was, and he had no previous history with the agency really. But the chief is saying now, in lieu of stopping everything and having this conversation about what should we be doing, where should we be doing it locally, what should it look like, he's saying, well, until we can put the brakes on and put the drones back in the boxes for a little while, uh, we're going to go to he hasn't said these words, but he calls it immediate fire suppression, to a sort of a 10 a.m. policy without saying the 10 a.m. But what he's saying is, let's go to a 10 a.m. policy in high fire season because of exactly what you just said. Even if we have a 10 a.m. policy, even if we put out everything we can, even if we reduce the wildfire inventory in a given week, a good percentage of those, some percentage of those are going to escape, and we're going to have the garnet fire, and we're going to have the these monsters that are going to burn and do their thing, and it's going to be hard enough for us in the current environment, any environment really, to take care of those fires that get away. So let's don't add to it by letting every damn thing go and having confine and contain if we can send in a couple of smoke jumpers and put the son of a bitch out. So it's not an irrational position on his part, but it does stomp on a lot of people's kind of pet fire policy.
Well, I
Uh,
think if there's a commensurate kind of focus on fuels and prescribed fire and solving the problem, but if as long as we're just saying we're going to do this, and we've been talking a big game, a cohesive strategy, and national fire plan. Like my entire career has been people talking a big strategy about upping the pace and scale of treatment, and then you see like you just see the steady decline in the capability of the Forest Service to do anything. So I mean, talk is cheap on the prevention side. So saying that like, hey, we're gonna adopt this full suppression policy to buy ourselves time to like do more mitigation. It's like, well, are we gonna do more mitigation, or are we gonna talk about doing more mitigation? We're gonna spend another 10 years in planning landscape scale projects while the rest of our remaining green forest burns to a crisp.
so that's where law and regulation come in, I think, because you're exactly right. The what seems like the sensible solutions that would incorporate things like some timber management and fuels mitigation, thinning, all of the things that a lot of people are arguing for, are not doable in the current legal environment. The ability of environmental groups like the Center for Biological Diversity and Chad Hansen and all the different players on that side of the aisle to sue the Forest Service. I mean, in a way, that was the worst thing they could have done. The worst thing that the environmental groups could have done in retrospect was the strategy that they employed, which was to sue us for every timber sale we put up, for every cow we tried to put out on the ground, and so on. And by doing that, they so truncated the Forest Service's ability to do anything. As you pointed out, they're out of business for all
Right.
intents and
Well,
purposes.
and anyone who wants to get things done and is going to work for SPI or a company that actually like does get
Yes.
shit done.
And so by all those lawsuits and all that pressure and finally opposing the Quincy Library Group and so on, what they did is they forced the Forest Service, like a Venturi effect, into wildfire as the only viable active management tool that the agency can use without anybody's permission. So I think there is a way forward, and I think the way forward has to be an open conversation, not sneaky agency policies like full suppression.
Well, you're a Lookout fan. You probably watched the interview with Bethany Hanna and Scott Stravinsky about tea kettle burning up.
Uh,
Um,
I looked at a little bit of it, but no, I haven't yet, but
I
I'm
think
going.
the I've done two videos now in the last week that are kind of basically like, is it too late? Is it possible? Is landscape scale mitigation possible? Like, I kind of feel like unless they completely shift the priorities and say like, hey, you want to do prescribed burning? You want to do fuels? We're going to send you a type 1 team and 2,000 firefighters and a caterer, and it's a slow fire year. We're going to spend that money on 100,000 acres of prescribed fire. Here's your type 1 team. Here's your 10 hotshot crews. Here's your type 1 helicopters to catch your slop overs. But until we get to that point, like we're just talking. We're just talking about like everyone's saying we're up in the pay scale. We're going to treat 1,000,000 acres, and then they're counting things like Caltrans like weed eating along a freeway as towards that 1,000,000 acres. And so
So
I just feel like unless we radically switch the paradigm here, like it's too late. We're gonna by the time we figure this stuff out, like we're gonna have 10 more garnet fires, and you're not gonna have a piece of ground between Kern County and the Oregon border that hasn't had a mega fire.
so let's talk about that. What if we had new laws, new legislation that authorized what you're talking about? I mean, because in a way, it's a fact right now that we're doing what you just described. Let's have a prescribed fire and let's use all the Type 1 helicopters and the super scoopers and let's go burn the Gila. Let's go burn the Aldo Leopold wilderness, all of it.
Right.
That's in fact what's happening now under the color of emergency fire suppression. Why not have new legislation that has the same effect of of waiving smoke requirements, state smoke regulations and so on for the period of a fire, even large fires, 50,000, 100,000 acres, waiving those things and making it possible in the cool seasons for the government to bring to bear the same resources they do in a wildfire to really start to get a handle in the cool seasons on the fire situation that way.
I think one of the problems is that the cool seasons oftentimes you can't get shit to burn. So, like we've got to, um, that you could have burned a lot of what burned in the Garnett fire, um, during the same period of time from the top of the mountain down and gotten radically different effects than if you let the fire rip up from the North Fork Kings, climb 3,000 feet, build a head of steam, and blast through this old growth. But, as soon as that fire ran out of slope, it went out. And so I think, one of the challenges I think is defining what fire season is and isn't. Like fire, you can have prescribed fire conditions in August in some of the higher elevation red fir forests. And if you wait until October, we're not going to get it burnt. So part of that is like, I think a big part of like scaling up is admitting that we have less control over a lot of these things as we think. Like, hey, if you're going to put 100,000 acres of fire on the ground, you might have a 5,000 acre high severity patch that you got 2 days of wind and the fire did that. And until we acknowledge that, hey, we're not going to put 100,000 acres of fire on the ground and get 2% mortality only in trees less than 8 inches or something.
We used to say if you're not scorching and you're not killing, you're not burning. And that's true. And I remember we talked about the patchwork of fire and how desirable that was, where you do have openings and you do have you do have areas that are slicked off and fertile ground for new growth and so on. And so I think that's possible. And in fact, that's where people are starting to take legislation is to make it possible to do what we need to do without the 40 and 50-year-old smoke regulations and other kinds of things that make it impossible for people. If you look at the cool seasons and you say, well, it's not just the cool seasons, but it's from mid-September or later in September, until the snow flies and so on. That's a much bigger cool season window. And if fire teams and firefighters could operate in that space without feeling like they're going to be arrested or whatever, that makes a lot of sense. And so there's opportunity. There's opportunity right now to do a number of things. One of the things that I think the agencies have dramatically misunderstood is the feeling in rural America. Everywhere I go, and I go all the 11 western states principally, but also in the southeast and the upper Midwest and so on, is the anger people feel about unilateral government policies. So when the Forest Service decides to have a full suppression fire where they're going to let stuff burn or they're not going to fight it or it's too steep or too rough, whatever the deal is, when they decide that, they're making a unilateral policy about a fire, and the fire doesn't understand that it's supposed to stay on the national forest system. And so quite often, like at Pole Creek in Salt Lake City, near Salt Lake, and so many others, the Roosevelt fire, et cetera, that fire, of course, leaves the national forest system and starts burning down private people and private property. One of the pieces of legislation we're working on is to say, okay, you can make these decisions to use wildfires for various purposes other than put. So if you have a policy other than put the damn fire out, if that's not the policy, and you have a different policy, that's fine. But because that's something you're doing for the public good, you're necessarily creating these situations of inverse condemnation where you're burning down private property for public purposes. You let that Dragon Bravo fire go, that's fine. But now you burn down a bunch of people's personal stuff and some, private property and state ground and so on. And now you have to pay compensation under the Tucker Act for inverse condemnation to the people who you harmed. That would go a long way to helping the public and especially rural landowners and so on start to support these things because it's one thing to say, yes, I support good fire, But if a good fire comes into Pueblo right now and burns my house down because of a decision somebody made to let something go down here below me in the Arkansas River Valley, and it burns my place down, right now there's no possibility of me having any compensation of any kind or any help of any kind for that decision that that agency decision maker made that I had no part in. And so I think there's a, for all of the, I don't want, not really disasters. We've had a lot of disasters, but we've had a lot of wins. And for all of the stuff that we've learned in the last 50 years, I think we have a lot of tools and ideas that could help us carry these things forward, because you're right. Fire's not going away, and bigger and worse fires are not going away because of management and fuels conditions and just natural. I don't know if you're familiar with the Canberra firestorm of 2003, but the sort of the body politic in that area had decided to take out all the fire roads and so on and let eucalyptus groves become more natural areas, as though that was a thing. Introduce eucalypts and so on. And so when those fires started near Canberra in 2003, they hadn't lost a house in the Australian Capital Territory for 50 years. Since 1952, they hadn't lost a house. They also hadn't added any firefighters to their 400 member firefighter force. And so they had no way to approach those fires. They had no roads to get in there. They had no way to manage what was happening. And when the lightning storm hit, all these fires came together and built ahead and burned into the Capitol and burned over 500 houses and so on. So we've learned a lot of stuff. Initial attack, aggressive initial attack certainly has a place. Merv George is the deputy regional forester over fire in Region 6 right now, and Merv is a member of the Huron tribe, Yurok tribe, and he's a burning proponent, but he's also a believer that at the height of fire season, when things are really going to hell, we need to reduce the wildfire inventory to the best of our ability so that we can deal with the ones that get away that there's nothing we can do about. And so I think there's there's a bunch of people, and there's a bunch of ideas, and there's legislation moving forward and so on. And I think now's the time for the agencies to drop the pretense and say, okay, let's have a conversation. Here's the cumulative impacts of everything that we've done. We've burned this many acres of high severity. We've lost 20% of the redwoods and 20% of the sequoias, and 200,000 mature sorrel cactus that we lit on fire on purpose down around Phoenix, etc. And so here's the cumulative environmental impacts of all this stuff. Now let's have local conversations about what we're going to do in some kind of truncated process, not the big monster stupid things that we started doing in 1980 and that everybody still has PTSD about because it was so frustrating to get anything done.
You thought like forest planning, or what was going on in 1980?
Yeah, forest planning. We started out with such high hopes, and the 3-year plan on the Coconino, and the 7th year we finally printed it, and I was on that planning team for 7 years, and we put it in the fire cache getting ready to mail it out the next day, and the fire cache burned down.
Oh man! So yeah, my dad, my dad's been interested in forest policy and growing up in Westwood and everything, and so I cleaned out my dad's office a couple years ago, and I found some like drafts of the Lassen forest management plan, and I mean it's still in effect, and the scoping meetings for that happened in 1977, and they had like 5 people show up, right? And so, but now like when the Dixie Fire burns 1 million acres. Half of it on the Lassen. The Lassen's like, well, this is all in the forest plan. This is all timber. This is all timber production. So we're going to go out and we're going to snag, 5,000 miles of road because this is all timber production. You're like, well, forest. It's not timber production anymore. Like they're not going to. It's not happening. But still, they're bound to manage that land based on this almost 50-year-old planning document that happened in a completely different climate era, completely different fire management era.
It's another euphemism. It's a lie. It's like full suppression. We're managing this in full suppression under and we're meeting the objectives of the forest plan.
Right.
That's
The
the other
50-year-old
thing.
plan that like now the whole forest is burned up. It's a forest plan for a kind of forest. And like when that plan was written, there were like 6 sawmills on the lesson, you know? So,
No,
but to me, like when I hear you, I cringe a little when I hear you saying like we got to go back and do a planning effort. Like I can tell that you spent a career planning, right? You got to convene the stakeholders, and we're gonna put together a plan. And to me, I hear that, and I'm like, by the time you're done with all that shit, there will not be any green forest left in California. So can we do better than saying that we need to go back into planning?
yes, and let me emphasize that we cannot go back into what many people in my generation in the agency see as the worst, most frustrating, most difficult years that resulted in 30-year careers in which nothing important happened. We cannot do that process again. We've got to have something else. Maybe it's an after action uh, scenario where we invite, local folks to come together on the Coconino or wherever it is. And we sit down and we say, here's what we've been doing. Here's how it's been working or not.
Mm,
Here's what we think, here's some ideas about what we could do. How are we going to move forward knowing that the next fire season is 3 months out?
right.
And so we
Well,
cannot
let's.
go we cannot go back to that. God, that to me terrifying. I remember I was coming in the door and an old forest staff officer friend of mine was going out the door, and as he was leaving I shook his hand and he said, you should find another line of work. And I said, what? And he said, yeah. He said, this forest planning thing, it's going to eat you alive. And I didn't know what he meant,
Yeah.
but he was right.
Yeah, my
And so,
aunt told me that. I graduated from high school, and I went and worked for the Forest Service during college on a timber marking crew and burned piles and had fun with it. And then when I graduated from college with a GIS degree, she's like, "What are you going to do?" And I'm like, "Well, I think I might stick around and work for the Forest Service." She said, "Don't do it. Do not do it." She's like, "You'll be a person like you be so frustrated." And I would have, I think, had she not, been there for me at that in my time of need, because she'd spent her career, she'd had a great career in the Forest Service, but she also had like gone from being a person that was like managing timber sales and hiking around in the Middle Fork Feather River all day to like
to an
being a.
inspector, a
She ended up
civil
being an entomologist. I mean, she had an interesting job, but she had a front row seat to that kind of 80s and 90s descent into kind of planning jail. I call it planning jail just because I feel like the Forest Service did a lot of bad things in the
yes.
60s and 70s, and then they got in trouble for it, and they're still in jail. They're still in planning jail. So I feel like, I just wanted to say, like, when I say that, like, hey, just turn loose the Type 1 fuels team and dozers and feller bunchers and everything else, there's some things about NEPA I like. Like, I do think we should have archaeologists out there on the ground to make sure we don't bulldoze village sites, you know? But let's keep that, like, let's hire native folks who know that stuff, and like you can do that stuff pretty quick. You don't have to spend 5 years surveying, before you go run a dozer somewhere. And but I think a lot of the botany and stuff that it's like we have all these kind of disturbance dependent rare species, and then like the botanists are trying to protect them from disturbance, and oftentimes it's like you run a dozer down this ridge and there's more of that kind of, Cuesta Ridge cornflower or whatever, checker bloom than there was before the fire.
That's another exciting development. Oh, damn it. I lost my train of thought. I'll think about it in a second. Yeah, we can't do that. Oh, so the NEPA rule. So the planning rule is changing as we speak. It's being rewritten from the ground up. And it's taking us back. When I first joined the planning effort in 1980 on the Coconino National Forest, the NEPA regulations we had were the CEQ regs. It was 12 pages long. And over the course of 7 years, I memorized them basically. But they were beautiful. They were so simple. They were so easily understood and so easy to implement. And regional offices and the Washington office in particular started adding crap to it. So that now you had to study bucket guppies in the lower Gila that had absolutely nothing to do with the project that was proposed. But you had to study them anyway. Why? Because some specialist somewhere thought, it was important to do that. And that got to the point where last year on the Carson National Forest, the forest supervisor required some major project proponents to do a pre-NEPA process, to actually go out and do scoping and to, prepare alternatives and to do all of this stuff with all that expense and all that time. And he hadn't even agreed to do NEPA yet. And so there's a backlash against that. We want to burn down that planning rule, the thing that it became, and go back to exactly what you're talking about, something where reasonable people like the Quincy Library Group can sit down together and figure out what the picture is in the local situation and figure, let's take it in small bites, eating the elephant. You don't have to eat the whole elephant. Let's start with the toenail. What about this toenail over here? What can we do to get rid of the fungus? And what can we do to, et cetera, on a local basis? I think we have all the tools, but the final thing that's not in place, in my mind, is agency willingness to admit that the wheels have come off the wagon and they're going over the side of the cliff. Maybe they went over long ago, and that they need to figure a way forward that involves the people who are the owners and the people that cherish the public commons of the national forest system. And I think we're at a place where we can get there. Now, this year is all about trying to retune, to refit the fire organization to remember how to fight fire in aggressive initial attack from about from about June 15th to mid-September. That's what this year's about. And the chief made a concession on that. He said you can still use managed fire in PL3, but there were a bunch of abuses of that. And so people keep doing these self-inflicted wounds on themselves, the agencies and so on. But anyway, we're moving in that direction. So let's get through that and, kind of rein in the horse, slow it down. It's running for the barn. And let's start implementing these kinds of things that you're talking about, where we have a simple planning rule. The NEPA regs are being completely rewritten to get back to the absolute fundamental basics. Let's only look at those issues and scope for those things that have to do with, the fire situation on this forest or whatever it happens to be. And then let's sit down together and talk about that issue, not the whole damn world that anybody and their brother
Right,
likes.
right, where you got to spend like 1,000 pages writing about global climate impacts of your 20-acre thinning project.
The history of Christopher Columbus and all the rest of it, and whether or not this project meets social justice. There's no social justice, and there's no environmentalist win, and there's no conservationist win, and there's no timber company win or anything else in the smoking ruin of that 194,000 acre run that happened on September 9th on the North Complex, when that fire team started burning the Bear Fire and the Claremont Fire together on September 3rd through the 8th. On the 9th, it took out 194,000 acres. It stopped when it hit Oroville Reservoir. It killed 16 people in Berry Creek. Those are the kinds of things that are these almost impossible to imagine unintended consequences of fire policies that are held in secret, applied in secret, unilaterally decided in secret. It's time to get out of the closet, talk about what we've done, how we did it, what worked, what didn't.
Yeah, well, I think you've talked about the bear a lot. I think that's where we first got on each other's radar. You were asking me about the Bear Fire, and I mean, I got friends or colleagues, that were making those decisions. I think one thing that gets lost in that conversation, and you're right that there's no winners, is that we're in the middle of a massive lightning bust, and those were the low priority. It was triage that initially made those calls. Was that, hey, we got fires that are threatening Vacaville and San Jose and Susanville and Napa County wineries and everything else. So yeah, the Middle Fork Feather right now is not going to get the resources, and so I think every time I see you talking about this one, it's like, um, at what point do you come out of triage? So you got a lightning bus, you got 1,000 new starts, and you decide, hey, these 10 different fires in the backcountry of the Plumas are low priority. At what point are you no longer in triage and they're like, okay, well, we saved Vacaville, we saved Susanville, we saved, um, you know, the vineyards, Patterson, all these places in California that were on fire, and now you get your resources because we usually have this mode of like, we're gonna we're gonna hoard these resources in this unit so we can mop up these fires and be ready for new ones. So, I hear what you're saying about like that bad tactical decisions got made on Bear, but I always feel like you gotta keep in context everything else that was happening during that bust, including the fact that the rest of the country was drawn down on resources as well, right?
Same thing with the Caldor fire. Caldor fire was the same thing. The Dixie fire ate up everything in sight. And so what was available to respond to Caldor was limited.
Mhm.
And so you're right. Let me just say this for the record. The North Complex may be one of those mid-level examples of not a good example of what I'm talking about. But the Black Fire in New Mexico is an excellent example, and so is Pole Creek and some others. And one thing that I'd like to understand is, I don't know if you have any kind of in-depth analysis about what happened from September 3rd to the 9th on the North Complex, but I have a series of maps. If you want to share screens and talk about some of these things, I can illustrate what I'm talking about, and you'll get it right away.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do with that is I want to interview a friend of mine who was the IC
Okay.
and put together and get a better take from him. I'd like to bring the take of someone who was like directly involved with that into the conversation, because it's really easy for us to look at maps and like I've looked at everything you're talking about with the firing that happened and how it blew up and how it crossed the river and everything.
No,
But I
that's a
personally
great
don't
idea.
know what resources those guys were asking for. Do you have the 209s from those fires of what they were asking for and what they were getting?
Yeah, yes. We did a 70-page report. There's a cancer camp. Have you heard of Camp Okaizu?
Is that in Yuba County?
Yep.
Uh,
Camp Okaizu is a cancer camp for kids. It was more than 500 acres of beautiful refuge of old growth timber, and they just finished a $10 million dining hall, and it was a spectacular camp for kids, mostly from San Francisco and the cities and so on. And that fire burned at the same time that Berry Creek did. And so we were commissioned to do a report for them about the wildfire forensics, what happened on that fire and how did it happen and where did
mhm.
it happen and so on. And so no report like that or no conclusions that we make are ever adequate.
Right.
And in fact, as Katie Hamburger in her book Dancing with Fire points this out so beautifully, two people standing next to each other on the same piece of fire line cannot tell the same story about what happened.
Right.
And so I think that'd be good. I think, in fact, that would be a public service if you would kind of dig into the North Complex and try to help people like me and Dave Daly.
Yeah, I've met him actually on a tour of the North. I took people up on a tour of the North Complex, and Dave was one of our speakers.
He just
We're running a prescribed fire training in Berry Creek this fall with the Berry Creek Rancheria,
Okay.
and we're using fire to they've acquired some land up there that's ancestral territory that they're restoring, and so we're helping them put fire back into the Berry Creek burn scar this fall.
Which is a good thing to do.
Well, I think a question. There's this distillation of risk and blame that gets put on whoever happens to be in the hot seat today. But we've got kind of this entire history of the Plumas National Forest between high grade logging and then total neglect of basic maintenance, planting a ton of trees, clear cutting in the 80s, planting a ton of trees, not thinning them enough, not getting fire back on the ground. that helped create that catastrophe. It's not that the catastrophe was created just because someone put fire on the ground to control a fire that was actually doing good 20 miles away. And this, you've got this kind of collective responsibility because more than half the land that burned in that initial run towards Orville was private timberland that was also not being maintained in any sort of fire resilient state, right? And so I think it's really easy for us to blame the IC or
No, it is
whoever,
our problem. It is our problem in common. Shouldn't the solution be our solution in common? Right now, it's in the unilateral hands of some bureaucrats.
Right. I thought it was interesting, I think part of SPI's legal defense during the Moonlight Fire was, hey, it's not our fault that the Forest Service land was so fire prone. And that's a good point, but the same point easily is flipped back on SPI. When a Forest Service fire burns onto SPI, it's like, well, it's not the public's fault that SPI's ground is not fire resilient, right?
Yes, it's it's what are there 490 million acres of public ground? And how much of it do we really manage in any way? Most of our management is benign neglect by necessity. In fact, it should be that way. Why would we want to do anything on a number of these acres of any kind, except get the damn wild horses off of them?
Well, that's a separate.
That's another show.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I agree, but I think, what we often forget is that fire suppression is active land management, in that by suppressing the fire, you're guaranteeing the fuel's going to accumulate, right? The shade tolerant species are going to turn into thickets, and you're going to create kind of catastrophic conditions. And so, like, I had someone was saying, like, yeah, if you had to do NEPA on every decision to put out a fire, like, there'd be too many adverse impacts to the environment that no one would let you actually put a fire out if you actually analyzed the full negative environmental consequences of that action.
I think, let me sum that up. Nobody that I know, no sane person advocates putting that kind of a decision process in play on a wildfire. Nobody.
Right. And I don't either. I just gotta say that. But if you look at it through that lens, that it's a good thing that wildfire is off the hook for NEPA in a lot of ways, because we can get a lot of stuff done. But that all of the stuff that is easy to get done during wildfire has negative environmental impacts. Putting out, so, like, let me just use an example of the Blue Fire. Blue Fire right now is burning. I'm going to share my screen here if I can. And I had pulled up all the Leopold wilderness to look at the severity here, but I'll just go back to blue real quick.
Okay.
I talked to a buddy on the Blue Fire yesterday, and blues, and I think you and I are both guilty of waving our arms on Facebook and arguing, like, we should have had this conversation like 5 years ago. But okay, so I talked to my buddy on blue, and he's on a hotshot crew, and right
Gila
now,
Hotshots?
what?
The Gila Hotshots?
No, he's on the Blue Fire on a crew, and right now, if you look at the ops map for today, they've got this mixed line here to tie in the PCT to this dozer line on top of the ridge, and
I'm not seeing whatever you're looking at.
I shared my screen here in Zoom. I don't know if you can see it.
I see some green line around something that says Aldo Leopold Wilderness and Sheep Mountain. I'm not seeing any operational stuff.
Let's see if this does it. How about now?
There you go.
Okay. Let's make our pictures bigger here if we can.
I love your capability on GIS. It's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I love it. It's fun. GIS is kind of love-hate. Like, sometimes it's really, it's come at the cost of a lot of blood and bent metal. Learning all this is not much fun to learn. But yeah, so anyway, Blue Fire burning in the 2014 burn in the Klamath. And So there's this mixed line that they want to push down in here, and they want to kind of cut off this fire.
Right.
And so I was just looking at the kind of the satellite imagery of the fire, and there's been portions of the fire that burned hot, but a lot of the mainly places that burned hot in 2014. But then a lot of it is backing through the trees that survived the previous fire.
Good.
And so now they've got some rain, and the fire's kind of laying down, and so I guess it looked easy on the map for them to put handline down this ridge to tie into the PCT and kind of cut off this end of the fire.
Yeah.
I'm talking to my buddy who's out there. He's like, there's like hundreds of like 4 to 7 foot diameter Doug fir snags down this ridge. All the small trees have already fallen down, and this is going to be incredibly dangerous. There's no kind of medevac possible because the smoke inversion's coming in every day, and they have no air support.
It's steeper than a cow's face.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, so they're asking us if we can go punch, basically cut down several hundred old growth snags to put out a fire that's backing right now, that's doing good in cleaning up a burn. And this time of year, in the Klamath, we've gone into almost prescribed fire season, with a good amount of rain and cooler weather temperatures. So I'm not sure exactly why I brought this up to think back on it, but
I know why you brought it up. It doesn't make any sense to do what they're telling him to do.
Right. And so, like, how do we empower the people? The people who might know this stuff best is probably the hotshot crew that's been spiked out on this ridge for 10 days watching the fire burn, who's, made up of people who've spent their entire careers doing this work. So how do we, in the conversation, get to where, like, we don't just say, like, oh, they're just letting us burn, reburning's bad. What I've been realizing is that there's enough variety in every burn that you can find an example of any point you want to make out there in the woods. If your perspective is that post-fire, like reburning another burn is bad, like, well, yeah, there's good examples of that. If your point is that, hey, letting the fire burn in the burn is good, like, you can make anything you want happen. So how do we get to a point where you and I aren't sitting back just on Facebook, like, inflaming our massive following, right?
Everybody.
Right.
Look at that. Go back to that example of that fire. So that the reality is we ought to be listening to that crew. And the way we would listen to them is there would be PIOs on that fire team. And those PIOs wouldn't be talking about full suppression, and they wouldn't be talking about hemming and hawing. They'd be putting out press releases. I was a Type 1 PIO for 11 years. They'd be putting out press releases saying, look, we're doing our damnedest to try to get a handle on this fire. But to get a handle on this fire, we're going to not only threaten our troops in the effort, but it's also going to be counterproductive. Why? Because nobody ever salvaged this country. We never took care of the massive dead fuels problem that we had. So we've got all this crap going on. We could come down this ridge to the bottom down here, and we could wait for that thing to back down and get to us, and we could try to get a handle on it down there. But punching down off this ridge doesn't make sense for all these reasons, and neither does dumping Phos-Chek and other kinds of retardants into those watersheds, et cetera, by the way. So, just the simple expediency of telling the truth in English would be an important way for us to start having that conversation on a local level about a local fire. The reality right now, I think, is fairly clear cut, and that reality is that what we're seeing is the reaction of all the people, including me, who've been madder than hell about some of these applied policies and so on, saying, well, bullshit, until we get a better handle on all of this and who's going to be making the decisions, we're going to put the damn things out, tooth and nail, hammer and tong, which is also the wrong answer.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think I agree with you that, empowering, like, part of this idea of scaling up prevention to the scale of suppression is that, like, I've got buddies out as division supervisors on these fires, and they say, I love it. I go to the briefing in the morning. They tell me what I need to do. They give me 250 men and a bunch of equipment, and I go do it. And no one's looking over my shoulder and saying, oh, you did it wrong, or I would do it this way. And so there's that trust, that empowerment of your kind of operational
It's
leadership,
the most
right?
fun. It's the most fun, most liberating, most personally satisfying job that you can do in government.
Right. So yeah, we got to get to the point where you empower the burn boss. You empower. You say your mission today is to burn out, is to put good fire on the ground here, and we're going to support you if it goes wrong. But your job is to take these resources, and that's that trust element of the operational leadership is what's lacking, I think, and it's also lacking from a lot of the people that are so traumatized by losing all of our forests that we trust firefighters to put the fire out, but we don't trust them to put fire on the ground.
Yes,
And so it's
yes,
like
that's
every
right.
time we post here that we're going to burn in Forest Ranch, people say, "What, in this wind?" And it's like, no, there's no wind, and even if there was, we could use it because the fuel moisture is 15%, whatever. And so that trust, building that trust, I think, right now everyone is so divided, but the recognizing that the trauma of losing our forests, we're pissed. But when we turn that into just blanket blame and shit talking, like, that's not helping things get better. Just, like
So
I'm mad
that's
at the Forest
another.
Service, right? I'm mad at their lack of action. I'm mad at losing everything that I loved in the Dixie Fire within 50 miles where I grew up. I'm really mad about that, but it doesn't mean that I think that people are just letting fires get big so they can get more money in their paycheck, right?
And I don't buy that one either, but I do buy that they're letting them get big because there are philosophical uh, arguments to uh, restore fire depleted ecosystems. I said that earlier. And so, much of the public, especially the outsiders looking in, but also inside the agencies, um, look at that and think, damn it, how was it when when they lit up? I forget how many acres now. I have it on my maps in my presentation, but when they lit up, 80,000 acres of the Tano National Forest, including all that heavy saguaro cactus, how is that restoring fire to fire depleted ecosystems? That ecosystem in the upper Sonoran Desert and the Sonoran Desert can't stand fire. Those cactus died in mass. They were lit. And so you're right. This is you know, it's like the dog catching the bus, okay? I told Rick Johnson of Idaho Conservation League this long ago. You're the dog chasing the bus, the management bus of the National Forest System, and one day you're going to catch it. And when you catch it, what the hell are you going to do with it? Dogs have trouble driving buses. And so that's what's happened to me. I've been yelling, I've been just pounding on alarms since 2013. Actually, it started with the flat fire there at Del Loma and Big Bar, a
Mm-hmm.
little bitty old fire that two fires started from a dragging chain, and two railroad guys got out of their pickup truck with a broom and a rake and put out the first one, and a Forest Service engine captain got out on the second one and started lighting the highway on fire. Why? Because they had a 1,600-acre piece of the Trinity Alps that had not burned yet. And they had made a management decision at the district that they were going to allow fires in that area to burn out that last piece. And they did. And then they charged the private companies who started the fire $10 million, $12 million for all the fire expenses related to their let burn decision and their expand the fire decision. And so that made me mad. And then I started looking at, getting involved in all these others, and that really made me mad. So you're right. I've been running around with my hair on fire, yelling at the top of my lungs, and suddenly we caught the bus, right? Suddenly the agency is now listening. The chief is tied in, we have direct message capability with him and so on. But now we've caught the bus. Now what are we going to do? It's not the time to yell now.
Right.
Now's the time to say, shit, we caught the bus. Now, what are we going to do with it? And I think that's what we've been talking about this whole time is what are we going to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
If the agencies would just stand up and say, okay, we've been doing all this stuff and we hear you, you know, some of this stuff's not working. Some of it is.
Mm-hmm.
Let's sit down together and talk about it for crying out loud. We've got 6 months to go before the next big monster starts.
Yeah,
Um,
well, it's nice in California. We're not in drought finally. And so helping people kind of I think one of our goals here is like help people kind of defuse the PTSD around fire, because the more people know that, like, oh, we're not in critical drought, the ERCs are not off the chart, like they can relax a little and not just be terrified every time they smell smoke.
Yes. And the onus is on people like me and Royal Burnett and all the rest of us to stop yapping at the bus and start figuring out how to help drive it.
Right. Well,
There's
and I think
just
that, both of you guys, both you and Royal, what Royal has to share is all this experience in putting fire on the ground. And what you have to share is, hey, let's not get stuck in planning. I spent 30 years in planning, and I was the same boat. Like I started doing planning work in 2000, actually 1999, and during that time, everything that I've cared about and written plans for is burned up in wildfires. So it's like, okay, well, let's not repeat these mistakes. Let's not just go back into 10 years of planning. The challenge is clear. Like, go to the places where there's too many trees and cut them down and burn. Like, we don't need LiDAR, right? We don't need AI. We need like a forester in a truck with a topo map. Same tools that did all this work in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Like, send a forester out in the woods for one day in a watershed with a topo map and a GPS, and they'll come back and tell you what you need to do. We don't need to, we don't need to model this out 1,000 different ways, right?
send them with a hotshot crew soup. You
Right.
know, have a couple of people go out there and a local rancher and have them go out there together and say, oh, yeah, this makes sense. So that there's some way to convey that what needs to happen in this local area is important and
Well,
doable.
maybe just send the right people out with a feller buncher
A
and
mass, a
a
master
drone.
data.
Don't forget the drone.
Don't forget the drones. I love drones.
Oh
Uh,
man. Well, yeah, I think a lot gets learned by the guy running the drone, but the consequences for failure are high. And so
yes.
learning on the job, I mean, that's how firefighters operate. But I agree that, you know, during Dixie, those drones were new and they put a lot of fire on the ground, and not all of it stayed in the box.
There's a guy, I won't mention his name here, but he's an operations section chief on one of the Dragon Bravo fire teams that was cycling through. And he was talking about that in his experience in the last decade, one of the principal issues that they've had, it reminds me of the Indian Wars in this country in the 1880s and 90s, where in the 70s and so on, when the tribes were trying to get their stuff together and kind of oppose what was happening to them, they had this horrible problem. And the problem was they couldn't control the young men. The young men were warriors, and they'd been taught since time immemorial that they needed to go out and count and coup themselves and do these epic deeds themselves. And they kept doing it, and it kept breaking up the the impetus of the tribe's ability to oppose whatever they're trying to oppose, the cavalry or whatever it was. And what this ops section chief said was that one of the key problems they're having, just as a matter of operations, is that Hotshots now and other fire folks and so on are so capable of laying so much fire on the ground so quickly that they very often are surprised, at the ICP to learn that, like they were on Alice Creek, that now the fire's burning up two private ranches because, a hotshot superintendent made a decision to fall back to the highway and light everything on fire. Same thing happened on the Roosevelt fire. Unbelievable. But yeah, all of those things can be addressed, but they can't be addressed outside the light of day. And what I mean by that is you've got to quit calling all this crap full suppression. We've got to call it what's what's needed here and what should we be doing here. And here's what we think we need to be doing here. And it's an emergency and we're trying our best. And we got this guy out spiked out on this ridge and he's telling us true stuff about how dangerous this is and how foolish it's going to be, and we should be down in the bottom letting the fire back to us, maybe strip firing up above and kind of helping it back down the hill or whatever. But without that, it's almost like lawyers have taken over public information, and as
Oh,
long
it's,
as
it's
lawyers are
terrible. The
running.
public information people can't
They can't talk
they don't give the population any credit for being sensible or knowledgeable.
or smart.
And they're just like, we're going to tell you the containment, and we're going to maybe tell you a little bit about this other stuff that's gone, but we're going to say as little about tactics as we can. We don't expect that anyone would understand what a firing operation was.
You just gave me an idea. I think I'm going to start rewriting some of these press releases coming out, looking for, looking for what it looks like the fire should be doing and what the team ought to be doing in this case that they are doing that's good, and maybe some things that look a little sketchy and
Well, and that's what we're trying to do here with look at. We're trying to thread that needle between like we don't want to be like armchair quarterbacks. I care a lot about what the ops folks would think if they read or hear what I say. And early on with like the Dixie fire, I had this feeling that the ops people on the Dixie were all mad at me because I was like writing stories about firing operations that had been lost. And in the last couple of years, one of the guys who was ops chief on that fire has become a real fan and supporter, and like calls me up and talks to me about this stuff. And I was like, man, I thought you guys all hated me. And he's like, no, well, why would we hate you? And it's just like, well, I think people, no one's used to the media asking difficult questions.
No, and then they see it. And fire, when you talk about, you remember how this was when people talk about fire operations, firefighters tend to take it personally if there's any note of dismay or anything else in it. Because when you're standing out there on the line, you can see the piece of fire in front of you and you know what you're trying to do. And then to have somebody come in and be up, pontificating from afar about what should or shouldn't have happened sounds like personal criticism of me.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I've tried to do is emphasize that it's not about firefighters following, their best instincts and so on the ground in place. It's about these fire policies that are unanchored to truth and unanchored to transparency. And, maybe we are doing all the right stuff the best way we can. But if that's the case, why hide it? Why not collect the miles of indirect line, even if it's wet line,
Mm-hmm.
from air tankers? Why not collect information on all the acres that we burned on purpose on a specific fire so the public can understand the scope and scale of what's happening? And maybe it's the right thing to do, but we can't know that unless there's some way to make those judgments, and you
Well, I
can't
think
make.
yeah, we get so stuck in the language, right? So like right now, the language is we're going to call everything full suppression. And in your career, you could write an essay that's first we called it prescribed natural fire, then we called it fire use, then we called it fire managed for resource benefit, then we just called it fire, then we called it a, adaptive management response, and we called it whatever appropriate management AMR. Like we've gone through a dozen
You
different
hadn't heard
buzzwords.
AFMR.
Appropriate management response, and
Oh yeah, I had.
and now we're stuck. So often we just get stuck in language, right? And they say these are your key talking points, but it's just kind of doesn't make any sense a lot
Oh,
of
we
times.
get stuck in it because people don't understand it. When I hear full suppression, I think people are out there 1 foot in the black with Pulaski's.
Well, I think what bothers me about it is like during the Green Fire, which I was watching burn by Lake Shasta, it was clear that they were going to let the fire burn out this peninsula, which made sense because it's a reservoir and it needs fire, and they already have NEPA done to do prescribed fire, and they were getting prescribed fire type effects. But when I call the PIO and said, "Oh, it looks like you guys are going to let you get some resource benefit," he refused to use. He's like, "We're absolutely not burning. We're absolutely not managing for resource benefits." And it's like, well, you are, and it's a good thing. And it would be great if you guys were saying like, "Oh, and by the way, the deer, the turkeys, everything else about this ecology is happy that we're underburning this oak forest," and take some credit for it instead of being like, "Oh, well, we just spent $35 million on this 10,000-acre fire, and all we got out of it was some black on the ground," right?
Pay attention to your to the. I know you don't really cross out of California too often, but pay attention to the Coconino National Forest and its fire communications. They're doing a spectacular job of doing exactly what you just said. And in fact, the Gila National Forest is doing a much better job than 2 years ago. Both those forests are now just talking about what they're doing and quite openly. And it's so refreshing. And it's interesting to me because I follow a bunch of stuff and quite often in the Southwest and so on. It's interesting to me how much heat the Tano National Forest takes because of their attitude, like you just described, and how much leeway the public gives the Coconino and the Gila because they're just being open and honest and willing to talk and engage the public in these things. A simple strike team of PIOs could help the situation everywhere.
Yeah.
Old school PIOs, what I call PIEIOs.
Well, Frank, I'm about talked out.
Me too.
But I'm glad we're talking. I think, yeah, we should have talked like 5 years ago. I
Well, I've
think,
been sending you money, damn it. I was wondering how big the bribe had to get.
well, I appreciate the support. We're I'm gonna go out in the field with Nadine Bailey and Roger Yeagle here in a couple weeks. They've been trying to get out in the woods for a long time, and I think Nadine came by my shop, and for a long time I felt like Nadine was the biggest troll I had on Facebook. Every time I wrote something about fire being good or whatever else, she would smack me down, and so I think so much of the stuff that we argue about on Facebook and everything, it's like let's try to just go out in the woods and because I feel like all of us have a lot more in common than we do.
We do.
Don't we all care about it. We all have our own ways.
We're arguing about 5%. The rest of it we agree almost completely.
Well, and I'm prone to be an asshole on Facebook, and I think you are too. Like we got to check that part of ourselves. Like just I notice when I get dark, I got dark about pot growers and a fire in Trinity County a couple weeks ago, and it wasn't good. And now I got blocked from some big fire page because I was an asshole and I probably deserved it, but it's
Yeah.
like I think we got to fight the urge our asshole urges
Yep. I got
to
shut down on Forest Service employees for a week. And I deserved it. I absolutely did. You're actually, and in this at this stage of the kind of the policy picture, I can sit back and breathe, and I am the dog that caught the bus in some of these areas, and so now it's time to quit barking. I agree, and I appreciate the visit.
all right. Well, thanks a lot, Frank. Thanks for making it happen.
Thank you,
All right, so we'll
Isaac.
we'll sign off here and then
I'll see you on your next update.
okay. See ya.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Zeke.